Hi, my name is Germán Kruszewski, and I'm a research scientist at Naval Labs Europe, located in Grenoble in the south of France. Today, I'm going to be talking about combinatory chemistry. This work can be framed in the subfield of artificial chemistries, which aim at developing models of natural chemistries, and one of their main goals is to explain the origin of evolutionary systems. Some of these models aim to be as realistic as possible, whereas others abstract away from specific details in order to focus on the core computational properties. Our work falls within this latter category. In particular, we proposed an artificial chemistry based on combinatory logic, which is a computational paradigm that was proposed in the early 20th century, in which computation proceeds by the application of rewriting rules on expressions that are formed of atomic elements called combinators. For this work, we adopt the I, K, and S combinators. So as I mentioned, computation proceeds by starting with some expressions, say for instance, this one SII applied to SII, and then matching, if possible, the corresponding rewriting rules that can be applied. In this particular case, we can apply the S rewriting rule by matching the F argument to I, G to I, and X to SII, and then applying the corresponding syntactic substitution to obtain the resulting expression. Now, computation can proceed by applying other rewriting rules that can be matched. In this case, for instance, we can apply the I combinator to this argument SII, which appears both here at the outermost part of the expression and also here at the innermost part. So we can apply it at each part in turn. So first on the outermost, then on the innermost. And then we are left with the same original expression that we started with. This is a property of this particular combinatory logic expression. So we propose an artificial chemistry based on combinatory logic, first by proposing that there exists a multiset containing all many possible combinatory logic expressions, and reactions are applied on this multiset. Some of these reactions that we call reduced reactions are going to be based on these original rewriting rules, but we modify them in order to apply a second desideratum of this work, which is the fact that we want to keep conservation of mass. Essentially, mass is going to be the total number of combinators that are present in the multiset. So at every time you apply a reduced reaction, we're going to make sure that the number of combinators doesn't change. For this, we modify the rewriting rules in two ways. On one hand, we add elements that were dropped from the original rewriting rules as byproducts of a reaction that are added back into the multiset in the case I'm applying a reduced reaction. On the other hand, whenever we have an element, such as for instance in the S reaction, that is duplicated on the right-hand side of the expression, now we are going to ask that in order to apply this reduced reaction, this element that we call the reactant must be present in the multiset in order for this reduced reaction to be possible. Otherwise, you cannot apply it. So computation, the evolution of the system proceeds as follows. We start from an elementary state, a tabula rasa state containing only elementary combinators. And then over time, these combinators are going to be mixed and matched by random condensations and cleavages, except when I sample an expression that can be reduced. So when there is some reduced reaction on an expression, this takes precedence, and therefore it's applied immediately. Note that for the reduced reaction to be possible, also the reactant that it requires must also, as I mentioned, be present in the multiset. So the fact that reduced reactions take precedence over anything else allow us to hypothesize the shape of possible emergent structures that could appear in the system. Namely, say for instance, the set of reactions that would be associated with the expression that we saw before, SII apply to SII, would constitute a self-sustaining set of reduced reactions, which are all going to be applied immediately whenever these expressions are sampled, insofar as the corresponding reactant SII that this first reaction requires to be applied is present in the multiset. And if so, this is going to be a cycle that is going to be executing in perpetuity, acquiring these reactants from the multiset and metabolizing them one step at a time, but in order to perform the computation and going back to the original expression. So observing that the fact that this self-perpetuating set of reactions are going to require the continuous absorption of reactant elements from the multiset, we propose to track the consumption of reactants as a measure or as a proxy for the emergence of structures in this chemistry. Now, how do these continuous supply of reactants that are needed by the structures, how are they produced? In normal conditions, they are produced just by random collisions between combinatory expressions present in the multiset, at least at the most elementary level of any emergent food chain that could appear. Now, the issue with that is that as the reactants become longer, you would need much bigger systems evolved for a longer time for these elements to be produced in at a sufficient rate to be able to feed any emergent structures that require them in order to produce a computation. Now, the issue is that we don't have perhaps all those computational resources, so we propose to emulate the production of these systems by an heuristic that we call reactant assemblage, in which we are going to say that whenever a reactant is needed and its size is below some given parameter f, we just assume that this would be, in general, be produced by random collisions. And then we create it on the spot for this reaction to occur from elementary combinators that are present in the multiset. So this is all there is to this system. We run experiments on systems composed of 10,000 combinators, and we run it for 10 million reactions. We vary the size of this food set for the expressions in this food set that we create on the spot. And then we track the consumption rates of different of the reactants. Now, here I'm showing some selected reactants to simplify the presentation. Here you can see in these figures the time on the x-axis and the level of consumption for a reactant on the y-axis. The dotted lines represent some random reactants. And here you can see, even without this reactant assemblage mechanism, how these structures that I was showing before start appearing consuming this SII reactant until it reaches some kind of ecological limit, which is the number of the rate at which this reactant is produced by chance. Now, when we apply the reactant assemblage mechanism, the system can go over this ecological limit because we keep on constructing reactants of this size. also some other structures with a longer cycle appear. Now, going to a larger size of the reactant assemblage, we can see the emergence of structures that depend on consuming reactants of size 4 and size 5. So the one with size 4 is the one that I'm showing here. It an expression that is composed of 2 copies of this reactant over its metabolic cycle is going to absorb two more copies of this reactant. One of them is metabolized in order to perform the computation, and the second one is attached to the end of it, thus growing in a recursive manner because it can keep on applying this operation over and over again. The green one here is corresponds to a structure that grows on a binary branching tree pattern. Now, notice that these expressions are more robust to conditions in which there is the resources start to dwindle, because even if I cannot apply the reduced reactions and say, for instance, I clip them here, then the resulting part is still going to be able to perform its computation when resources become available again, whereas the original, the self-sustaining structure that we saw before, if I cleave it, essentially it loses its function, and therefore it's less robust, and that may explain why it goes extinct in this particular case. Finally, we can see the emergence of self-reproducing structures, which are structures that depend on a reactant of length 6. This structure is formed by 2 copies of this reactant, and over its metabolic cycle, it's going to absorb 3 copies of the reactant. One is used to perform the computation, and 2 of them are going to be used in order to create a copy of itself. Thus, we can see the emergence of self-reproducing structures. So to conclude, we have seen that combinatory chemistry is a simple algorithmic artificial chemistry with intrinsic conservation laws, in which emergent structures that self-sustain, that grow recursively, and that self-reproduce emerge out of the dynamics of it. In the future, we will seek to apply it to the research of emergence, of the emergence of evolvable units. Wish us luck with that. With that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thanks.